Welcome back, everybody, to the next episode as we work our way through Extra Histories series on D-Day. Today we're going to be taking a look at the German side of things. This one's called the Atlantic Wall, so I'm assuming we're going to be looking at the Germans as they built their defenses and how they went about that. I'm excited to dive into this. My goal with all of these videos is that hopefully I can share something that maybe you didn't know before, and hopefully in the process I learned something that I didn't know before. And with that in mind, the comment section below is perfect for that. If you have things that you can add to what's been said, let us use our collective knowledge to share what we know with other people so we can ask questions, we can learn, we can come away from this knowing a little more than we did before. So I'm excited about this because this is a place that I very much hope to visit. And with your help, we're going to be able to do that hopefully soon as COVID starts to clear up. One of the things at the top of my list is a journey to France and to Western Europe so I can explore some of the sites. A lot of the Atlantic Wall is still there, not in perfect condition, of course, because it was attacked by the Allies. But there are places you can see very clearly what it was that the Germans were building, and you can see just how strong those defenses were. So let's go ahead and dive in to the Atlantic Wall. Don't forget to check out the original content creator. The link's in the description below. Please remember to subscribe to our channel here. You can do that with the subscription button down below, and if you hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications, you will be notified every single time new content goes up or if I post some information that you should be aware of. Let's dive in.
June 6th, 1944 is a day that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has been looking forward to for a long time. His wife's birthday. With bad weather making an invasion impossible and intelligence suggesting that Eisenhower's waiting for more troops, the commander of Normandy's defenses has decided to go home and surprise his wife with a pair of Parisian shoes. In the middle of the night, his phone rings. The invasion's begun. This episode is sponsored by Wargaming. New players can download World of Tanks and use the code NEPTUNE for free goodies. Link in the description. The Nazi leadership had begun preparing for D-Day even before the Allies held their conference at Tehran. Following a British commando raid at Saint-Nazaire and the landings at Dieppe in 1942, Hitler had realized that even if an invasion lay years off, the Allies were already capable of hitting ports in occupied France.
And we should say, too, that they were thinking about the Allied invasion even before Dieppe and Saint-Nazaire. And by the way, I don't think that, maybe both, but I know for sure, I don't think Saint-Nazaire fell until the Germans surrendered. A lot of these really, really strong defensive positions on the Atlantic Wall, we just surrounded them and left them be because there was really no reason to lose men attacking them when really our object was to take Germany and knock them out of the war. But, I mean, as soon as they knew they were going to be conquering France, they were already thinking that at some point this was going to come back on them when they knew they wouldn't invade Britain. When Operation Sea Lion, which was the plan for invading Britain, was called off and they decided that they weren't going to be able to do that, they started immediately thinking about defense. And that was defense all the way along the Atlantic Wall, not just on mainland France, but also all the way up to Norway they had to defend as well, because it could have come from anywhere.
His solution was the Atlantic Wall, a line of coastal defenses that originally clustered around ports but eventually stretched from the Spanish border to Norway. Rather than building a continuous defensive barrier, German engineers drafted 1 million forced laborers from France to create a string of machine gun and artillery positions. These hardpoints had overlapping fields of fire, with artillery intended to fire along the length of the beach rather than out to sea. This allowed the German army to cover a larger amount of territory with fewer men.
And see, this is something that was really smart about that. And if you go there even today, you can see that. You can look at a long beach, and rather than placing, if you just think about this in your mind, rather than placing 4 or 5 guns that could only hit the area directly in front of them, you put the gun facing down the long axis of the beach, and now you can cover that entire length. That way, wherever they land, you're going to be able to hit them. There was a lot of wisdom to how this Atlantic Wall was planned, especially once Rommel was put in charge of it those last couple of years, the last year or so especially. He really did think of just about everything.
A consideration that was crucially important by 1944. In late 1943, Hitler had appointed Rommel as overall commander of forces in northern France. It was a political as well as practical appointment, leveraging Germany's most famous general in order to reassure the troops and the public. Rommel also had a personal relationship with Hitler, which allowed him to operate semi-autonomously outside the chain of command. When Rommel arrived, he was shocked at the state of the Atlantic Wall. Command had stripped troops for the Eastern Front, and many of the men were either new recruits, conscripts from Eastern Europe, or had gone soft garrisoning the wine-soaked towns of France.
And that's important too, because think about it. If you're a conscript from Eastern Europe and your heart's really not necessarily in this war, you're probably not going to put up quite the fight that a hardened German soldier would. And that's important because this is the place where this matters the most. In fact, Rommel, his philosophy on this was that if they didn't stop the Allies at the beach, then Germany was going to lose. He figured the first 24 hours was how the war was going to be decided. That they either needed to throw them back right away or else it was over, because in his mind anyway, once the Allies got a beachhead and started getting troops across, there was not going to be any stopping them. So it's interesting that the place where he felt the war would be decided, you would have conscripts from Eastern Europe.
Allied bombing had nullified the Luftwaffe. Rommel went to work. He sent veteran units to supplement the poorly trained divisions. He seeded the ground around the defensive emplacements with mines that jumped into the air before exploding.
Bouncing Bettys.
At low tide, he sank a forest of wooden stakes tipped with anti-tank mines that sat just below the waves.
By the time the D-Day invasion happened, I think there was something like 5 or 6 million mines that had been placed along the Atlantic Wall. Think about the logistics of that, and think about the danger of that afterwards and how much cleanup there must have been. I'm not familiar with how they dealt with all of that, but it had to have taken years to deal with all of those mines.
Now, any invader would have to choose between running the gauntlet at high tide or landing at low tide and crossing 300 yards of open beach. He also flooded the low country, erected poles to tear apart gliders, and stationed troops inland to slow the Allied advance in preparation for a counterattack.
And this is what I'm talking about when I said that he really did think of everything. He flooded the low country to deal with paratroopers. So, if there's water everywhere, there's not a lot of good landing spots for you as a paratrooper. The poles to not allow gliders. Remember, we talked about gliders a couple of episodes ago. They don't have engines. They're just going to glide in and basically do a controlled crash landing on the ground. And if you got poles everywhere, it's going to tear you up and destroy your glider before you can make a safe landing. So they really did think of all the possibilities of what could happen. And this is why the counterintelligence and all of that kind of thing that was going on was that much more important, because the Allies were going to need every advantage they could get against this kind of defense.
But planning around that counterattack was a problem. First of all, they didn't know exactly where the Allies would land. Luckily, German intelligence pulled off a coup. They successfully deployed multiple agents in England. Soon, they were receiving reports of armies marshalling to attack Pas-de-Calais, along with diversionary attacks in occupied Norway and... what was the other one? Normandy? Whatever. And aerial reconnaissance confirmed forces massing for these attacks. Of course, every single one of those German agents was actually working for the British. Good work, Garbo. Regardless of where the landings took place, Rommel believed the battle would be decided on the beaches. Should the Allies establish a beachhead, it would be over. In his plan, the divisions defending the coast would slow the enemy down in preparation for a decisive counterattack. As a result, he wanted the Panzer Reserve under his own command, close to the shore in order to sweep the Allies back into the sea. However, Hitler's leadership style started to affect strategy. From his early days in the Nazi Party, Hitler had promoted a kind of social Darwinism among his staff, giving them overlapping responsibilities and intentionally fostering feuds and competition. This meant that subordinates couldn't amass enough power to challenge him, and it elevated his position as the final arbiter of any dispute. In this case, Rommel was opposed by officers, including the elderly Eastern Front veteran von Rundstedt, who wanted the tank reserves held near Paris. This would keep them flexible in case the Allies landed somewhere unexpected, and shield them from shore bombardment.
And this is just another example about how Hitler's leadership style cost the Germans dearly. Another example, of course, is in the invasion of the Soviet Union, when he repeatedly gave orders that went against what the generals on the ground wanted to do in given situations, whether it was when they wanted to attack somewhere, the direction that the armies were going to go, or their desire to withdraw when they knew the situation was impossible to win. You have to wonder how different the war might have gone if Hitler had let the smartest people in his military do their jobs and do them well.
Rommel countered that the long drive toward the coast would make them vulnerable to air attacks. After fierce debate, they put it to the Führer, who, ever indecisive, created an unworkable compromise. He broke up the reserve, giving Rommel 3 panzer divisions and keeping the larger reserve around Paris as a personal unit, which couldn't be moved without his express permission. Only one of Rommel's divisions, the 21st Panzer, was sent to Normandy. So the stage is set for June 5th, and the weather could not be uglier. With conditions so poor for both sailing and flying, senior officers relax in the knowledge that the Allies will not arrive anytime soon. Many take the opportunity to rush home on leave, and that is when paratroopers start to land. At 5:30 a.m. on June 6th, German soldiers peer out of their bunkers to see shapes in the morning mist.
Could you imagine being one of those German soldiers and looking out and seeing, I don't know how much they could have seen from any one given point, but there are literally thousands of ships on the water, plus the bombardment that's happening, plus the paratroopers landing behind you. Must have been not a good feeling.
Ships stretching from horizon to horizon. Then, aircraft engines. A massive Allied bombardment rocks the ground as bombs, naval shells, and rockets pound French soil. But the bombers drop too far inland.
Yeah.
The rockets fall short. Naval guns make little headway against the steel-reinforced bunkers. 1,745 tons of ordnance drop on Omaha Beach without killing a single German.
Wow.
But the roads inland are wrecked. Worse, Allied paratrooper and glider units land between the static units and the reserve, with resistance elements destroying crucial bridges and rail lines, meaning that reinforcements and supplies can't get through. Landing craft begin to plunge toward the shore. On Omaha Beach, the Germans see the first Allied soldiers trudging in the surf. Machine guns open fire. Far away, Allied soldiers lie face down, pinned, as the first wave of mortars and artillery shells fling bodies into the air. Months of preparation mean that German artillery crews have ranged out the beaches and know exactly where to drop their ordnance. The initial slaughter is monumentally one-sided.
So you have to think about that. I mean, all of the things the Allies are doing at this point, the naval bombardment, the air bombardment, it's all missing. It's having little effect. But the Germans, on the other hand, like you said, they've had months to zero in their targets. They've probably done plenty of practice fires. They know exactly how to fire and where and when. So, yeah, it's definitely very one-sided when it comes to the advantage being with the Germans. But those forces that are supposed to be there as reserves, the whole plan that Rommel had, could not be effectively maintained because of the issues with the reserves. And that's what it came down to.
One American company at Omaha takes 92% casualties. By 1:30 that afternoon, German observers at Omaha report that small groups of Americans have broken through, but the defense is holding. They're pushing the Allies back into the sea. But Omaha is the exception. Despite fierce resistance, the British have broken through at Sword and Gold, and the Canadians at Juneau. The botched American landing at Utah has reorganized into a chaotic opportunity. Here, the bombardments have had more effect, and the terrain isn't as challenging, but men still die in droves. The chaos on the beach is mirrored at every German headquarters between Normandy and Hitler's vacation home at Berchtesgaden. Generals argue over whether to commit reserves and where. Rommel is rushing toward the battle in a staff car, unable to issue orders. His rival, von Rundstedt, quickly orders the 21st Panzer to meet the British advancing on Caen, and issues orders for the reserve units near Paris to move out. But his orders are countermanded. That unit can only be moved by the Führer's personal order, and Hitler is asleep. Ever since his days as a bohemian in Vienna, Hitler has always been a late riser.
So, think about this. The fate of World War II may have come down, I don't think it did, but it may have come down to the fact that Adolf Hitler was sleeping in that day.
Rigid procedure dictates that the Führer should not be woken unnecessarily, and even in the face of invasion, no one wants to break this protocol.
And this is what happens when you govern by fear. Even when the situation is desperate, that fear still holds. And this is why, at least in my mind, governments that are democracies are always going to do better than a dictatorship. Because when you govern by fear, then that fear is not only a strength, but it's also your greatest weakness. And in this case, that fear was a weakness because everybody was afraid to wake him up and tell him so that they could do what needed to be done.
After all, what if it's only a diversion? When Hitler eventually wakes at noon, he is thrilled the invasion has arrived. This, he says, is his chance to decisively crush the Allies. And yet, he delays. It's 4 p.m. before he orders the Panzer Reserve to move out. By that time, the clouds have cleared, exposing the column to Allied air power. So instead of advancing, the unit ends up hiding in the woods until dusk. It will take them 2 days and a night to join the battle.
Too late.
As the Allies overwhelm German defenses and march inland, Hitler spends his day ordering V-1 revenge strikes not on Normandy but on London, then holds a conference with minor functionaries. When Goebbels shows him the Normandy landings on a map, Hitler exclaims with delight, "Just where we expected them." Goebbels, who has heard Hitler rant for months about how the Allied target would be Calais, simply nods at the Führer's historical revisionism.
Yeah. And remember, here's the reason why that 2 days it took for the Panzers to get there matters. Because these beachheads, while great, they mean nothing until you can connect them. And that has to happen inland, which is one of the reasons why we dropped the paratroopers. The paratroopers were there not only to cause confusion, but also to secure those bridges and those connection points so that this can all be put into one continuous beachhead. And then we have to go up here and take the ports and all of that. So if you can get those panzer divisions in there and counterattack right away before they can do that, you can destroy the paratroopers. You can prevent the Allies from establishing those beachheads. But that crucial time was lost.
After all, Hitler is somewhat right, in a way. They all knew that a diversionary landing would happen at Normandy. Probably best to keep the strong units in Calais. Meanwhile, the Atlantic Wall is crumbling. Even at Omaha, the defense has degraded. Ammunition is running out. Artillery emplacements fall silent. Americans begin breaking through and enveloping the casements. At Caen, the Germans see one last opportunity, a gap between the Canadian and British lines. A grenadier regiment rushes to exploit it, and by 8 p.m. radios that they're on the beach. With armored support, they can hold. But the Allies have gotten wise. When the 21st Panzer tries to follow, they find themselves running a gauntlet. Fire pours in from both sides. Every minute, another tank explodes. Seeing that the window of opportunity has closed, their commander orders them to halt and dig in around Caen.
And this is because there was just the one Panzer division. Had there been multiples, we couldn't have concentrated our firepower, especially our air power, on that one particular unit.
But the defense is stiffening. All along the battlefront, Allied units begin failing their first-day objectives of advancing and linking up inland. By dusk, the Allies have scattered beachheads, but not much more. Within days, German reinforcements will arrive, and the hedgerows of Normandy will become a killing field that will dwarf the casualties of the landings.
So the hedgerows, let's talk about this for a second. They were basically these tall, thick, like 6 feet, 8 feet tall hedges that were really, really thick. And you could be walking on one side and have an enemy 6 or 7 feet away from you on the other side and not know it. And this is what they're fighting through for miles and miles, not to mention all the flooded fields. And, it's a brutal piece of terrain to have to go over. And he's right. The initial, we set out Operation Overlord was not just the D-Day landings. It was the entire aftermath of that. We set out a series of goals. This is where we need to be by this day and by this time and so on. And we were far behind initially in the first few weeks. But then once we really established things, we broke out and it happened really fast.
D-Day is over, but Operation Overlord could still fail. To win, the Allies are going to have to push just as hard on D-Day +1, and D-Day +2, and every day after that. For all of these forces, American, British Commonwealth, French, German, and Soviet, the fight would continue for 11 murderous months. But the Allies now had a beachhead, and in trying to throw them back, Germany would spend more men, fuel, and equipment that they could ill afford. Allied victory is a long way off, but for the first time, it's in sight.
So once again, really good stuff. I hope you're learning as much as I have about this. I believe there's at least one more episode, maybe two. I don't remember for sure. But, just to give you an example of what was planned versus reality, the 101st Airborne Division, Maxwell Taylor was the general in command. He had told his troops that they could do 3 days and nights of hard fighting, and then they would be relieved. They were on the front lines for the better part of a month. And that shows you how different the situation was on the ground than how it was necessarily planned to go. So we're going to talk a little more about this. I imagine the next episode will deal more about the continuation of Overlord now that they've landed on the beaches. As always, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Let me know. Don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you check out the original content creator. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode. Thanks for watching.